why they did that. They asked me where I wanted to go. Immediately, St. Croix popped up in my mind for several reasons. One, of course, is the weather. Some of you may have spent 30 years in New York like I did back in the day. I wanted to be here. But also, I wanted to come back to a place. I had a rough childhood here. I want to tell you a little bit about it in the history in Christiansted. And I thought, I'm going to come back and make some amends. You know, we didn't have psychotherapists back in those days. So, but another reason I wanted to come back here, I realized there's so much rich history here on St. Croix. And I thought, maybe I can be a conduit. Maybe I can be a vehicle, since I've gotten famous with that play in New York, to start to talk more about our local history beyond me. But maybe I could be the lead on that, since I do have a bit of an ego. But with that said, I want to start by saying this. I owe Lynn Miranda a great deal. You know, I had, I was a great orator. Not like Stacy, though. I had some cutting ways in my ways that I talked. And so the next four presidents after I died had disparaging things to say about me. But Lynn Miranda, miraculously, Broadway play, brought me back to life. I owe him a great deal. Just think, anything can happen, folks. 250 years later, I'm a Broadway star. But with that said, I have one gripe to pick with Lynn Miranda, and we're going to get him here someday, and I'm going to tell him to his face. In that play, he called this a forgotten place. Oh my gosh, this was anything but a forgotten place. 1765, I arrived here from the island of Nevis. I was 7 years old. And the Caribbean at the time, let me remind folks, this was part of the biggest trading route in the world at the time. Of course, the manufactured goods were coming from Europe, raw materials from the States, the slave trade from Africa. We're going to need to talk about that. I witnessed a number of things with my own two eyes. And so this was the biggest trading route in the world because of sugar. The taste had changed in Europe. People wanted sugar, the demand for sugar. So the European countries were out there in the waters fighting over these countries, these islands. St. Croix is very unique and first in many different ways. For example, when the Danes bought 1733 from the French, it was the first time that an island was bought. They were fought over, so it was unique for us here. But let me take you back in time to try to emphasize the value of the Caribbean back then. Then I want to talk a lot about St. Croix. The Caribbean, because of the sugar, Ben Franklin was thinking about Bermuda as the 14th colony. The English, after they won the French and England Indian War, they considered trading all of Canada for the island of Guadeloupe. You can't imagine the value. Sugar was white gold. And so we were on the map here back in those days. So what about St. Croix? 1733, when the Danes bought this island, Christiansted, they developed it, a guy named Mott. Now, many of you might not know this. This town of Christiansted was developed on the model after Oslo, Norway, which was part of Denmark at the time. It was called Christiania, something like that. And they picked St. Croix, I think, because of a lot of the flat land here. Also, if you look out at Christiansted Harbor, it's hard to get into Christiansted Harbor, and they realized that we could often be safe. Pirates would come up, look around, and say, it's not a good bet to come into this harbor. We can't escape. Christiansted has never been attacked from the water in its history. So the Danes came in, and they laid out Christiansted after Oslo, and you'll notice the streets. They go from east to west. They go to where the wind comes through. They had zoning. If you had a lot then, they wanted to develop the island, the town, they would do eminent domain after a year if you didn't develop it. There was a lot of pressure to develop. People lived on the second floor. They had businesses on the first floor. And let's see, what else about Christiansted? I want to, St. Croix, let's broaden it a little bit. St. Croix, now I have an agent, I have to admit, I'm 257 years old. He tells me there's a place in California called Palo Alto. It's sort of like the epicenter of technology, whatever that is. St. Croix was the epicenter of sugar back in the day. I can't emphasize the quality and the quantity. We outproduced Jamaica, 4,500 square miles in this heyday from 1760s to 1800. St. Croix, 89 square miles. We outproduced Jamaica. We outproduced most islands in the quality. So that was a big draw for the
Mr.
Danes.
Hamilton, can you
And of
speak
course,
up, please?
what's that?
Can you speak louder, please, Mr.
I can.
Hamilton?
And so part of the trade route, of course, the enslaved came through here. Now, I arrived when I was 7 years old. And you know, if you would walk down Christiansted on Company Street back in the day, oh my gosh, was it alive. Lynn Miranda got it all wrong. There were animals everywhere. There were 17 rum bars. There were food carts along the road where you could get lemonade and coconut water. There were women walking up and down with their on top of their head, fresh baked bread, avocado, music coming out of different stores, different places there. There was a lot going on, and there was a lot of diversity. Now, people tell me today we have a lot of diversity on this island. It's one of the shining stars, I think, of what my agent tells me of the island today. Well, guess what? We were the first back then. We had 5 different religions back in those days when I was a youngster in 765. Most of the Caribbean islands had one religion. What about class? We had a wide range. We had beggars, we had prostitutes, sailors, pirates, and then the finest carriages of anywhere in Europe would come down Company Street. Okay. Yep. And so there was such a diversity in class. And then what about race? There was a lot of mixed race in Christiansted at the time. How about this? Free slaves and free gut. Now, not many free slaves were able, out of the goodness of the heart of their owners, some of them had to earn it. They were talented. They were artisans. They could do a promissory note, down payment, and they were released. And so free gut, up on the hill. They were free in every sense of the word. Well, not exactly. The asterisk is they were discriminated against. They had to live on the other side of the Company Street, up on the hill, which is called free gut today. And they could only live in cottages they could build 36 feet by 36. Now, the Danes designed Christiansted. Who built those buildings? Enslaved people built those buildings. They were talented artisans, and they're solid. You can see after all these years, 23 hurricanes since I was here back in the day, and those buildings still stand there, and the pride of enslaved people who built them. What about other things about Christiansted? I mentioned class, I mentioned race. What about culture? We had 2 dancing schools in Christiansted at the time, and there was a troupe that came down from Philadelphia that put on Shakespeare plays. Lynn Miranda, this was a happening place back in the day. But the downside of that, we have to acknowledge, as Stacy said, what was happening back in the day was the enslaved. And I would see them as a youngster at the age of 7 to 17. I lived in Christiansted. I would walk by, some of you know the old post office on the bottom of Company Street. That was the Danish West Indian building back in the day. That was built in the 1740s. The architecture we have here, the history is amazing. Right across the street is the Steeple building. How many people know this? The walls are 2.5 feet thick. Back in the day when I was here, I didn't really frequent it much. I was too busy trying to hang on to life. But they were mahogany benches and marble floors back in the day. I'm trying to give you a little more description. You walk down the street in Company Street, and the smells and the noises. It was just alive, people living on the second floor. How about the Danes? They regulated the heck out of things. How about the archways that we have? They demanded that you would have those archways, but they gave them an economic incentive. The economic incentive was that you only tax the square footage on the first floor. So here I am. I arrive at the age of 7. I come from the island of Nevis. And boy, I wish you could have met my mom. She was from a French Huguenot. My dad, they weren't married. My mom had a prior history here, some of you might know. She was married to a not-so-great guy. He put her in jail. Back in the day, I thought he must have been an amateur psychologist. Put her in jail, she'll come running back. Not my mom. She made a beeline for Nevis. So my mom and dad were never married, which made me a bastard child. When I arrived here, can you imagine this? I'm Alexander Hamilton. I'm on the $10 bill. I helped push, here we go. I helped push through the Constitutional Convention. I became the first Secretary of Treasury. I designed our financial system. I was called the messenger of the future. And I was a bastard child with no formal education. But I was homeschooled by my mom. If she was alive today, she'd be the poster child for homeschooling. She even taught me fluent French. And boy, did that come in handy when I was aide-de-camp to George Washington later in life. I could translate from Lafayette's strategy and add my 2 cents, and Washington had no idea what I was up to. So from 7 to 10, my mom started a supply store at the end of Company Street. It's actually right where the Alexander Theater is in Times Square, and pretty successful. It wasn't upper class, but we were middle class. From 7 to 10, I helped work that, and then tragedy struck me. My mom died in my arms at the age of 10. She's buried in Beeston Hill, by the way, at a place called The Grange today. And that was the first tragedy that happened to me. And then I went to live with my cousin Peter because my grandmother and my grandmother died at that time. My aunt and uncle owned the Grange. Now, Senator Hatch came down here in 2007. There was talk of trying to have a memorial here. The feds were going to pay for it. And they thought that was an ideal place. But then they realized I never lived there. My aunt and uncle had sold that the year before I got here. But my mom is buried there.
And things were okay. And then when she died, I had to go live with my cousin Peter. He was 33 years old. The old Nova Scotia Bank right there on King Street at the lot. He was a troubled man. He had mental health issues, financial problems, and he committed suicide after 18 months of me living there. This is my start in life. You know, one of the things that I realized about St. Croix and the enslaved here and the people here, me being one of them, is the grit and the resiliency we have from the experiences that we had back in those days. And I learned a lot about grit and resiliency from those experiences being a young man. Now, my luck changed. I went to work for an import-export company, the lieutenant governor's office there, where, Nichols Newman, there's a new law firm there, right there on King Street. He had an import-export company. He was a rich guy from New York. A lot of folks came here because of the wealth they could make with the imports that would come in, the trading that was going on. And I went to work for him, and I became a clerk. That was a good thing. Also, Nettie Edwards, my little friend, who was my exact age, his parents take me in as a guardian right across from St. John's Church. And so I finally had a family, so my luck started to change. And then at the age of 16, I wrote a letter to Ned. He went off to college, Columbia, and I said, woe is me. I'm stuck here in the Caribbean. I really want to be somebody. I had a driving need to be famous. I even ended that letter saying that I wish there was a war, anything to try to be famous. But I realized that I probably wasn't going anywhere. I had no connections. I had no family. I had no money. And then Mr. Knox, the Presbyterian minister. Now, the ruins are right behind the old Pink Fancy Hotel. That's got a new name, Sugar Apple, I think it's called. And right there was a church. And Mr. Knox was a medically trained doctor from Ireland. He came here to be the minister, and he mentored me. That's why I came back to St. Croix, was the mentoring that I got from these folks. And he had a library there at the church. He said, Alexander, anytime you want, come and use the library. I would read all the classics there. And then what I also would do is, there was the Danish American Gazette that published the minutes from Parliament over in England. So I had a pulse a little bit on what was going on out there in the world. I was a nerd, by the way. I worked hard for Mr. Kruger, and then I made a beeline to that library. You could see me in Christiansted back in the day with my head down. I couldn't wait to get there. I burned the candle late into the night, studying the classics. He trained me how to write, and boy, that's significant. I call that ruins there, the Presbyterian Church, the birthplace of the Federalist Papers. I was a writer, and I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. They originated right here in St. Croix, the education I got from Mr. Knox. Now, what happened there, I was stuck here. Many of you that know the play or read the book, a devastating hurricane hit St. Croix in 1772. I picked up a pen. I started to write a letter to my dad. My dad had abandoned the family, by the way. I never saw him again. Historians say I was orphaned. I wasn't technically orphaned. He was a good guy. He just couldn't make anything work. And I did write to him later in life and sent him money. But I wrote a letter about the hurricane. And in that letter, I said that wealthy people in town should take care of the poor. And then I described the hurricane. And apparently people liked the prose that I wrote. I wrote things like the angels, the destruction was so bad it brought astonishment to the angels. The Danish governor read it, and he said, I want everybody in my government to read that. But lucky me, Mr. Kruger, the import-export owner, he read that letter. And it was anonymous. I left out, Mr. Knox made me put it in the newspaper, practically twisted my arm. By the way, I didn't want it published. We did it anonymously. That was the last time I didn't want anything published. I published quite a bit later in life. But I honed in there from that ruins of the Presbyterian Church. My understanding is it was ruined in 1823 by a hurricane and never rebuilt. And there's a rumor that Mr. Knox is probably buried there. I've gone there once to try to find the gravesite. I haven't found it yet. So that hurricane letter, it got published. Mr. Kruger saw it. He said, Alexander, come here. He said, sit down. I knew you were bright. I knew you were smart, but I didn't know the extent. You're a genius. We're going to take up a scholarship fund here in Christiansted from the rich merchants. We're going to send you back to the States to be educated. And they got together. They got a bunch of money together. And at the age of 17, they put me on a boat. And in the play, there's a song, right? In New York, you can be a new man. Now, you might think, I'm 17 years old. I have a lot of anxiety about going to the colonies with no family, no connections. But boy, I had a need inside of me. I wanted to be somebody. And we have a famous congresswoman who has a quote, I think something like this, that here in the Virgin Islands, we think big, even though we're from a small place. Well, I had that on my mind. I was going to go to America. I was going to try to make a difference. I wanted to be somebody. I wanted to leave my childhood behind. I didn't feel like that I was going to be accomplish anything unless I got there. And back in those days, by the way, to be famous, you had to do something important, like find a new republic, something like that. But what I want you to know is that I had the best education in trade and commerce in Christiansted Harbor, dealing with the different folks. In fact, when Mr. Kruger had me and put me in charge at the age of 14, he got sick and went back to New York. First thing I did was I fired the lawyer. I had a Crucian side to me. I took charge, and I let people know what I thought. I wasn't holding back anything. A number of other traits, too, about me I'll mention. But the lawyer got fired. I said, don't worry, we'll find another lawyer. Another thing I used to do was chastise the pirates. Yep, 2 minutes. I chastised the pirates that would come in because they were late. Which route did you come in? And they would say, well, we came by Cuba. That's where the pirates are. Don't ever let that happen again. A number of different things I did. But when I got to America, I got into a prep school. And that prep school was the letters I got from Mr. Knox. I got into Princeton University. Typical Crucian, though. I said, hey, I want to graduate. I want to graduate in 2 years. He said, you can't do that. I quit. I went over to Manhattan, Lower Manhattan. I talked my way into Columbia College. I joined the debating society. I started a militia. Now, you all look like honest people. Can you keep a secret? I took some of my scholarship money from St. Croix, and I started a militia. I outfitted them there in Lower Manhattan. Lucky I did that. 1775, revolutionary fever in the air. General George Washington comes up. My militia of students melts into the Army. I become part of the Army. And I did a lot of courageous things. The generals noticed me. And guess what? This skinny, scrawny, orphaned immigrant from St. Croix at the age of 21 becomes the aide-de-camp to General George Washington. I did 6 years with him, and I went on to be a fighter in the Army. I became a hero in the Battle of Yorktown. I begged George Washington to put me out there. I became first Secretary of Treasury. One last thing I'm going to leave you with, two things actually. As Secretary of Treasury, I designed the financial system that we have today. I was called the messenger of the future. You have no idea the opposition. I know things in Washington are rough right now. People called me all kinds of names. They picked up on my childhood, but I pushed it through. I had that Crucian liming way. I got Thomas Jefferson in the room. I said, Thomas, I'll support moving the capital from New York if you'll support my financial plan, which he was against. He said it was the last thing that he wished he had never done in his life. He tried to water it down. But we got that through. The reason that there's no memorial for me anywhere probably in America, I don't care about that. Washington's got his, Jefferson's got his. But if you look around anywhere in America, look at the prosperity, look at the commerce. I started the first bank. I started the U.S. Customs. I started the U.S. Coast Guard. All that I learned from this time in Christiansted in St. Croix back in those days. I did die at the age of 49. I had a duel, and they say that there was I died at the age of 49. There wasn't a dry eye in the place in New York as they paraded to Trinity Church. Even my enemies recognized a great statesman had died. My last thought is this. I'm back here in St. Croix. I think it's time that we honored more of our history here in St. Croix, not only for tourism, but for our local folks as well. And I think because I've become famous with that Broadway play, maybe I can use me. We'd like to start a museum here in Christiansted, but that museum will be the lead, will be Alexander Hamilton, but we want to have a museum about enslavement. We want to talk about what people went through here. We want to highlight what people, heroes from St. Croix, and we think that's important. So we don't depend on government because we know that they have other priorities, but we're hoping to raise money and have a museum here beyond just Alexander Hamilton. Thank you very much, everybody. My time is up.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hamilton. Thank you so much, Mr. Hamilton. We appreciate that. Was an amazing history recounted by Mr. Hamilton, aka Wayne Nichols. Thank you so much. We'll give him another hand clap. Next, we are going to have the lovely Miss Randell Gerard come and share with us about all places Free Guts. So be careful. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. You can hear me. Hi there, my high school classmates. So, my name is Frandel Gerard, and I head up a little organization called Crucian Heritage and Nature Tourism, also known as CHANT. We're located in the town of Frederickstead. A lot of our activities are centered in Frederickstead, but we also reach out to the entire island and the Virgin Islands. So my talk is about a little place in Frederickstead, because most Christiansteaders, when I say it, say you mean in Christianstead, is Free Gut. And what is Free Gut? There's a term that was used by the Danes, which is now deemed a derogatory term. It was called negragada, and it was set aside in both towns, in the back streets of the towns, for free blacks and people of color, many of whom were never enslaved by the Danes, many of whom resided in the Free Gut areas with no free papers, because all freed by the Danes had to have documentation. So one must ask, where did they come from? And as we look, we find names like Mingo, which is a very African name. We find in Free Gut in Frederickstead, African women who are free, who do not have mulatto children, who are anchoring Hospital Street by about 1785. Free Gut in Frederickstead is established prior to 1777. The documents are lost. We picked them up in 1777, and we find these large, substantially large town plots. There's one half of a block that we've done a lot of work on in Frederickstead on Hospital Street. It's the half a block between the southern wall of St. Paul's Episcopal Church and Queen Cross Street. And there are 8 parcels. In 1777, 7 of those 8 parcels were owned and occupied by free black people. They were carpenters, they were shoemakers, they were bakers, they were all artisans and craftspeople. And I know Mr. Hamilton might be a little surprised to hear me say that they and many of the enslaved Africans that were brought here were the engineers and the designers that built, and the builders. They were the craftspeople. The Danes didn't build anything. The Danes didn't design a whole lot here either. That was done by a number of Englishmen that were brought in. The Danes owned, they financed, they mortgaged, they provide mortgage money. But you know, where in Denmark do we see those beautiful arches in both of our towns, Christiansted and Frederickstead, filled with these arches? I've been to Copenhagen, I didn't see them there. Are they in Norway? I don't think so. They're fundamentally Moorish and Northern African, right? That design is African. And we can see the relationship between the mills. And you can go to Great Britain and you see many mills that look really similar. But you go to the Dahomey capital that precedes Great Britain by thousands of years, and that's the design. So the ancestors that were brought here didn't gain their skill when they took them off the boat. They were selected for their skill sets. They were selected because they knew how to grow sugar and cotton and tobacco. Just like in the Carolinas, they were selected because they knew how to grow rice. They were selected because they knew how to build from stone. They knew the crafts. And they were the ones that built these towns. And they lived in wattle and daub houses in the back streets of the town of Frederickstead until they could build their own buildings. And their buildings are called vernacular construction. Most of them are on stone foundations. A few of them in Free Gut actually have coral foundations. and coral stone represented a degree of wealth. And then the upper structures were wood. Most of the buildings in Freegut were single story, and you'll see on that little half a block on Hospital Street, half were single story, two are two-story, and one has to ask why. And what we see is the properties going back and forth from free black ownership to working class white ownership to free black ownership. And they change hands almost every 4 or 5 years until it becomes exclusively black owned by 1810, 1815, thereabouts in the town of Frederickson. One woman that we were introduced to, her name is Mercy Wade. She's also Maria. She's also Elizabeth. She changes her name every time she gets a new husband. I think she married 2 or 3. Every time she buys a property. And she becomes one of the larger property owners in Frederickson. A woman brought here from Africa who somehow is emancipated, we're not sure how, who then begins investing in real estate. And she begins to be one of the principal developers of the Freegut area in Frederickson town. And there are many others that we have their names. One of the things the Danes did, they kept good records. And fortunately, a number of them were salvaged before they were destroyed in the transfer. And many had already been sent and were in Denmark. But the census data, the matricula data, all of which is now available to those of us that speak Danish and can navigate the Danish archives, and those of us that have figured out a way to figure out the English subheading. And we can document all of these people. So when we speak of the enslaved Africans and the free blacks and the white population, we need to put it into perspective. So at its height of the sugar production in St. Croix, and we have to understand the largest sugar producing properties were on the western end of the island. There were anywhere from 1,700 to 2,200 whites on the island of St. Croix. And there were about 1,700 to 2,100 free blacks. And there were about 20 to 22,000 enslaved people. Not that so good. So the production was great, 1, because of our soil, 2, because of our rainfall, but 3, because of the industrialization of sugar production using black bodies. They couldn't do it without the enslaved Africans. And those people resisted. They ran away. That's why we have Maroonburg. Slave masters would end up not waking up certain mornings. Who knows what they drank the night before in their tea? There would be work slowdowns. There would be grand marronage, where people left for good. There would be petit marronage, where people just took a couple of days off. And there were rebellions. And what we know about Freegut is it becomes a place of organizing. It becomes a place of shelter for Maroons. It becomes a center that grows resistors. And some of the leading organizers for labor unions, both here and in the United States, some of the leading thinkers for the civil rights of black and brown people in the United States. One of the first women who would get up and speak on podiums in New York City. Her name is Elizabeth Hendrickson, born on Hill and Hospital. She would stand shoulder to shoulder with men like Hubert Harrison and Marcus Garvey, and then would develop the Danish West Indies Women's Society in New York that became one of the biggest funders for the poor and the destitute here in the Virgin Islands. We had this memory of resistance, the reality of organizing. I'm not leaving out emancipation and Fireburn because that feeds that into the 19th century. And Free Gut in Frederiksted becomes the epicenter for the intelligentsia that leaves and moves to the United States. And they become appropriated as African American, many of them, but they become the early civil rights activists in the city of New York. So as we confront the realities of today, Free Gut is that destitute, derelict area that some of our leaders would like to appropriate and bulldoze. We need to carry on the fight to preserve and promote and archive the history of the buildings, because the built environment kind of shares that, and we can see it, and the people by name, so that when one thinks of an enslaved person or of a free black man or woman, there's a name that comes to your mind automatically. Thank you. Join us anytime for a chat walking tour, and we'll tell you some more.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ward. What a lovely, and very straightforward view of our history. I love it. Next up, we're going to have the lovely Miss Sonia Jacobs-Dow, who is going to share with us the history of this hallowed place, the Wynn Museum and Great House. Please welcome her.
Thank you, Jim. Good afternoon. I don't know what your day has been like today, but I certainly know what mine has been like. And I try to start everything that I do with something that strengthens my spirit. I am not professionally trained at this, but the spirit of Nana Kofi Boateng has been talking to me this afternoon. We lost Kofi last year, but whenever we had an important gathering at WIM, Kofi was usually here to pour a libation.
Hold up the mic a little.
To center us. Sorry. Kofi was usually here to pour a libation, to center the program, or help us to become centered, to receive the program. So I'm going to do this in the manner that I do it at home, and I'm going to pour this libation for my ancestors, the oldest ancestors that I've been able to discover thanks to the records in our library here at Estate Wynn, and thanks to people like Jerry Doward and the other volunteers who helped us all to discover our stories in St. Croix and in the Virgin Islands and beyond that. So I ask you to join me and to think of your own ancestors, whoever they may have been, whatever they mean to you. But I pour this for my great-great-great-grandmother, Yariko, who, despite being enslaved after she came from Africa, managed to keep the name Yariko throughout almost all of the records in which she appears. And I'll tell you later how that was so, why that was so. I also pour this libation and call upon my great-great-great-grandfather, Jacob Frederick, who married Yariko after he too was brought from Africa and enslaved on St. Croix. And I ask of them, as we do when we do a libation, because we know that our ancestors love us, and we know that they do everything that they can to help us. So I ask them to guide my emotions, and my thoughts, and my words as I do this deed of telling you about Estate Way. Hi. Sorry. Okay, sorry, dear. I'm sorry. To any of you who are not hearing me, just wave your hand. Do anything, just remind me.
Thank you.
Whenever I walk onto this property, I am very cognizant that I'm in a sacred space. It's a space that's sacred to me. And we want it to be sacred to anyone who had an ancestor on St. Croix. And for those who don't have an ancestor on St. Croix, we'll lend you one. So that you can understand this space and what it means to us. And through her mask, I'm seeing Winifred Clark Hardy, another one of our researchers like Jerry Doward, and our exhibit curators who helped to make this space so special. But the space is first special because we walk in the footsteps of our ancestors every time we step foot here. And every inch of the soil that we walk is a walk in their footsteps. Think about that. When you walk here, for me, I'm always so cognizant of the people who were here before, of their experience, of their toil, of the conditions under which they lived. And Frandel told you some of that. I want you to know they had to construct their own housing. Those wattle and daub shelters, they had to make those. Because for enslavers and those that they charged with managing the people that they enslaved, prior to the announcement that they were going to end the slave trade, and we'll come to that. But prior to that, enslaved people were expendable. They were not considered people. They were not considered human. They were not considered worthy of shelter and food to keep them alive. They were expendable because there was another ship coming tomorrow. So you worked them to death. You worked them to death because you could replace them. And if you think about anybody that you love, and think about them having to be worked from before sunup to long after sundown. And what would that mean to you if your ancestor was the one that had to endure that? And grief is part of that. But so is the wonder and amazement at the fact that so many survived, and didn't only survive, surmounted this horrendous institution. Those are the things I think about when I'm here. And if your spirit is quiet while you walk here or while you sit here, you can hear them. You can feel them. And when you do things that honor them, you feel them. You feel their gratitude. So for me, the day starts with walking around and thanking them. Thanking everybody that was here. And I have to tell you, I have some ancestors that weren't enslaved. And I always say a prayer for them. I say a prayer that they may have been granted the opportunity to ask forgiveness, and that they didn't waste the opportunity. Right, Brittany? Because it's because... I'll be happy to walk around after, but I think it's going to be really hard to walk the spaces and talk. I think, and that's what I was trying to tell the bird. Yes. Yes. Okay. So, our story is a complex story. It's not pick you up in Africa, bring you here, and then that's it. There are all these intricacies. And I'm not a romantic storyteller. To me, a romantic story is the story you tell to make yourself feel better about a painful past. And I don't tell those stories. But I do think of all the people who are in my background as human beings. And that's why I pray for them. Landmark Society is the successor organization of an organization that was created in 1948. It was created with a very diverse membership. Diverse in ethnicity and race. But people of means. And you can see some of the work of that early organization in the Steeple building in Christiansted. This is where their first exhibit went. Where they hired, and it didn't hit me until I was already working here, my father's eldest sister, Valmore Jacobs, as the first docent. And that hadn't struck me until I started working here. So I'm walking in her footsteps too. And through a number of reorganizations and mergers, you have St. Croix Landmark Society in, I believe it was 1954, shortly before that, leasing most of this property from the government of the Virgin Islands. The Great House didn't have much of a roof, didn't have much of a floor, didn't have much in the way of shutters, had plants growing out of it. Deja vu all over again. And through a lot of work and effort, the Great House was opened in '54 as a museum. And though the society reached out to the public, and one of the first activities that happened here was a party for the neighbors and a party for the children at Queen Louise' home, which is actually within walking distance. It stalled there for a while. The owner's story the manager's story was the focus for many, many years. And the exhibits that you saw in the Great House were about their lifestyle. There was beautiful furniture in there, including some made by the descendants of enslaved people who were enslaved on St. Croix. But the story never told, their story was never told. That wasn't the focus. It wasn't thought to be an important story. And so we, Landmark Society, have to take responsibility for having ignored the rest of the story. And I wasn't the first one, but when I came to work here in 2009, we began to build on what had happened before us. And I'll never forget Mr. Merwin, may he be resting in peace, Robert Merwin, who told me that the year before, the then president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation came to St. Croix for the gala celebrating, I believe it was the 60th anniversary of Landmark Society. And after he had been taken to dine and feted in restored great houses and grand spaces, and he had seen the museum, the most important question he asked is, where is the story of the Africans and their descendants who were enslaved on St. Croix? Who's telling that story? And I took that as a charge from Mr. Merwin. It was already in my spirit. But him telling me that story, I took as a charge. So we started to build on good work that had been done before us, but to expand the story. Because no part of the story should be left out. So we didn't stop telling the story that had been told for so many years. We just expanded it. And we started talking about the people who were enslaved here. And we started talking about the Masons who were here when the Great House was built, when the chimney was built, when the windmill was built, when the other structures were built. And who were the carpenters that likely made the first shutters? And who were the people who lived in the stone slave quarters that still exist here on the property and on our neighbor's property right next door? And many of our neighbors, if you look at the other houses outside of this part of Wim, you can see old stone walls. So we started to talk about those cabins and double cabins where people with skills that were appreciated as carpenters and joiners and coopers and blacksmiths, where they lived and who they were. Because the records are there. One thing that Denmark did an excellent job at was tracking its money. They didn't miss a penny. So the King of Denmark, I know Tiari, we're running.
Yes.
You guys want me to stop?
Well, just so we could walk to the mill.
Okay.
That was our big thing. We want to walk.
You're going to find out that the mill is not the most important structure here, but I'll walk you to the mill if you want to go.
Thank you.
What is the most important?
Yes.
To me, for me personally, is what we now call the cookhouse and the space next to it, which are actually where, after we moved from the wattle and dog structures, where the people who were enslaved and assigned to work in the Great House, where they lived. And sometimes in romantic stories, we think of house servants or house slaves as having an easier job. I don't think any of the people who were enslaved thought any of it was easy. But if you were a cook, a nanny, a butler, a chambermaid. You're on duty 24 hours. Because you're going to be called for whatever is needed in the great house, whether it's an owner living there or a manager or an overseer. So to me, those structures have greater importance. They also have importance because I believe it was 2016 when we helped a group of young people that are our junior preservationists go to Denmark to participate in a program that we had agreed to, a UNESCO program that we agreed to participate on, which deals with the transatlantic slave trade, and trying to create curriculum and detailed teaching materials so that finally the whole story would be a part of the history lessons, not only here, where that we had some lessons, but in Denmark, where there were 0 lessons. Most people who came to visit us here at WIM could tell you that the Virgin Islands were once the Danish West Indies, and that Peter von Scholten freed the slaves. That was it. That's what they knew. Because Denmark had national amnesia. And so the story wasn't taught and it wasn't talked about. And I'm talking about students who came here 3-4 times a year as part of the traveling school, who had completed high school, and during their gap year before college, were spending this time in this traveling school in St. Croix and St. Thomas were 2 of the places that they visited. And I would always start my orientation by, tell me what you know about us. And I think we were probably into the 5th year of that traveling school before somebody said, my father took me to a part of Denmark so that I would see the buildings that were built by the wealth that was created in St. Croix. And I had walked past those buildings all my life and nobody had told me, and there was no signage there. There was no way for me to know that story until my father did that. And then another student said, my uncle wrote a book and it's in Danish. I can give you a copy, but unless you know Danish, you can't read it. But he wrote a book about the story and he made her read the book before she left on her traveling school. About 5 years into that travel school visiting us before we came to somebody who knew something about the Danish West Indies, now the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the institution of slavery, and how people in Denmark got rich off of it. So I'm telling you, they're following their money. So follow me, and I'm not going to look at Tioni. She's going to have to come over here and take the mic from me. Or our congresswoman will go on to come and take it from me. So to follow their money, the Danes did censuses, which were done at least every 10 years. There are a few times when the census is done more frequently. And both free and enslaved people are listed in the censuses. But for enslaved people, you get their name, including a surname if they have one. You get their age, so you can kind of work out their year of birth. You get their denomination and the year of baptism. And this is important. You get the job that they have, pre-emancipation for women, you know how many children they have alive. Why would that be important in a census? You know whether they've been punished, and if so, how many times and sometimes for what? You know their moral character, but you have to think about who's creating the census, right? So the person who runs away 5 times a year, now we would all be cheering on, right? Because they're escaping slavery. That person might have a moral character as bad, terribly bad, horrible. Jerry, help me. What are some of the others that we've come across? You might have someone being indifferent. And then you might have those people who are good, there's one that means so-so, and I can't remember what it is, but, and so they have this census, details all of this information. And by the way, the reason it's important to know how many children the woman has alive is because it adds to her value, monetary value. And then you have matricles, you have inventories where you list everything on the property, from buildings to horses and carts and donkeys, and yes, people. And there's notice of who was born, who died. And then these records are cross-checked, right? Because I don't trust you to give me all the information. So the churches have to submit reports every quarter of baptisms, confirmations, marriages, and burials.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Ms. Sonia, thank you so much for all this lovely history. So these records, they're all available here?
How many of you know that Landmark Society has a library and archives? Oh, so I'm happy to tell the rest of you.
Yes, yes.
So in the last building, and that's
this building?
Congresswoman Basket, that's the other building that I think has so much importance.
Yes.
Because that's where you go if you want to research academically for a paper you're writing or a book you're writing, or you want to research your family history, or you want to research your property, because those records are there.
And we can go anytime now?
The library is open by appointment.
Okay.
Our researchers, our dedicated volunteers are all, I'm going to give a little room, 60 or older. So many are closer to the older than 60. And so if you email the library at stcroixlandmarks.org, you can make an appointment to come in. It's a tiny space, so we usually have one person scheduled at a time. Okay? So those are the three most important. I could go on. The only other space I want to tell you something about, next to the two spaces, next to the cookhouse, is a space that was once part of the slave quarters, and where I believe it was 2016-15, our junior preservationist created an exhibit on the transatlantic slave trade. And these young people were between 8th grade and 12th grade. And they created an exhibit that is extremely engaging and reflective of what they've done. And then the other space is between that building and the library. There's an open space where we created, our interns created an exhibit that we call Long Rows and Big Yards. And it's a long row where there might be 3 spaces that people live in on the same property. And then the big yard, which is the shared area, shared space where people cook, wash, practice their trade, and so on. We reopened less than 2 months after the hurricanes. We reopened on the 11th of November 2017. And we were able to do that because a few years earlier, we had added the Living Museum as part of the museum, where we have tradition bearers teaching you everything from how traditional medicines are used, bush baths and teas and salves and other things, to carriso and drumming, how our native candies are made, fish pots are made, and so on. That's what allowed us to reopen that quickly after the Great House had been severely damaged. COVID closed us, but we're working to reopen the museum fully to the public. And I'm going to stick around, so if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm sorry, is a question?
Okay, you can take that question offline. But so I want to thank everybody for being here. I don't want the Mampis to get everyone. And some of you may want to drive back before it gets too dark. but the spaces that she spoke about are open right now. If you'd like to go and take a look. I also want to thank the staff that is here. There's Anthony, and Anthony, thank you so much. Thank you, Anthony. And who else was here to help us?
Maria.
Where's Maria? I don't know if Maria is still with us.
She's drinking some more.
Okay, so thank you, Maria, as well. So thank you all for coming. These were 3 very different discussions, different interpretations. I'd love to have you all's thoughts about next year, what should be done, or maybe we don't wait till next year, you know? Different groups, different, maybe we need to have regular discussions. Maybe next time we have some drummers. Maybe next time we have a discussion about, you know, some of the trades. I see one of our younger cultural bearers pushing for things. Shalana, thank you so much for being here. Stand up there, they can't see you. Thank you so much, Ms. Shalana Brown, for being here with us. And any ideas you have for, you know, how our government can support doing this, we're happy to hear it. So I think this is a good time for everyone to go and look at some spaces while we still can. And there's some refreshments there. And please mingle, speak with each other. And as they said, some people will be around to answer questions. Yes. Thank you all so much, and there's so much more we can discuss. Let's keep the conversation going, and happy VI History Month, everyone.